Did you know that the average high school romance lasts about 3 weeks? Catherine Thompson and George Holmes defied that statistic by staying together for over 40 years. They met when she was a freshman and he was a sophomore, and their bond remained unbreakable. Their love seemed truly timeless and enduring. However, before you get too sentimental about this seemingly perfect couple, I should mention that Catherine and I were married for about 30 of those years, and I thought we were genuinely happy. Our marriage felt fulfilling, and the birth of our daughter Joan only brought us closer together. I was a content man during those years. To provide some context, I'm Thompson Marsh, and Catherine has been my loving wife for the last 30 years. Catherine and George's high school romance eventually ended, but only temporarily. After graduating, George worked on the Alaskan pipeline with his uncle, and that's where the trouble began. He stopped reaching out to Catherine, leaving her in a difficult position during her senior year. Despite dating someone else briefly, Catherine's heart still belonged to George. Catherine waited like the dutiful girlfriend, but George was absent and not very communicative. Apparently, George really liked working on the pipeline and began a rather nomadic life, figuring that his dear Catherine was still waiting for him to make his fortune and sweep her up in his arms. Upon his return, well, that didn't exactly happen. The reality of life is that things move on, and nothing ever stays the same. That applied to Catherine also. As she went to college, got her degree, and met me at a party when she was 24. I was a bit older than her at 29, but we made a good match. I fell in love with her the moment I met her, and I thought she had done the same with me. Our marriage was fairly normal, and the only blemish on our courtship was when a letter arrived 2 days before our wedding ceremony from George. Just like the prodigal son, he was finally coming home and wanted her to meet him. Thank God that Catherine's mother talked her out of going to him, telling her that her new life beckoned and not to waste herself on that waste, as she referred to him. After some tense emotional moments in which I was worried she actually was going to call off the wedding, Catherine finally went through with the ceremony, becoming my wife, Mrs. Catherine Marsh. When George finally showed up, it was too late, as Catherine and I were already on our honeymoon. George, in a fit of despondency, apparently enlisted in the Marines. After the honeymoon, we settled into our new lives. Catherine is a nurse, and I am an underwriter for a major insurance company. Insurance isn't glamorous, but it is steady and pays the bills. My marriage was solid, but there was only one tiny hiccup that kept recurring. George started corresponding with Catherine, and she cheerfully wrote him back. When I asked her if it was necessary, she got indignant and said, "Oh, Tom, don't be jealous. He's an old friend who is lonely in the Marines, and I am just writing to keep his spirits up." Well, I couldn't plead ignorance, as I knew he wrote her regularly, and I also knew that she wrote him back regularly. Neither her family nor I could convince her to stop writing until she got a letter telling her he had married a girl where he was stationed. That stopped the correspondence, and my peace of mind returned. The next 3 years, I think she received 3 Christmas cards from George, and that was it. During this hiatus from George, our daughter was born, Joan. With our child, Catherine and I came together like a team of matched mules and worked hard building a home and equity so that Joan would have a good life. Yes, life was good back in those days, with both of us working together to raise and care for our child. But as is always the case, something would always spoil it. One day, a letter arrived for Catherine from George. She never spoke about it, but I noticed after that our consumption of stamps increased. Her eyes, I deduced, were reaching out to George again, but I let it go. After all, he was off somewhere making the world safe, and I was here making my family's world safe from want. If they wanted to write to each other, it really was their business, regardless of how I felt about it. Eventually, Catherine began to share some of her information from George with me. He had gotten divorced from his first wife, but now had another. He had seen combat and was apparently highly decorated. I listened half-heartedly, but Catherine spoke with pride over her soldier. I corrected her, saying that he would be upset being called a soldier as he was a Marine. Catherine gave me a cute giggle and said, "Oops, I guess I'd better watch that." Watching her talk about him really depressed me, but I hoped that someday she would finally get over him and focus on her family. Well, she never did. George stayed in the Marines for 30 years, married and divorced 3 times, and now had enough medals to make General Patton envious. It was with dismay that I realized that while George had become more glamorous in my wife's eyes over the years, I had only gotten old and predictable. My one hope was that George, when he was discharged, would settle down somewhere far away from us. Unfortunately, he didn't, and that is where we are now. Joan, our daughter, grew up and is now married to a great guy, Frank Campbell. The other great news is that they are expecting their first child. I am now 60 and looking forward to the magic number 65, so I can go off and spend my last few years in peace and retirement. Catherine still looks beautiful and still can make my heart pump fast. Little did I know that my life's tranquility would soon become a thing of the past. It was a Thursday when I came home to find Catherine dressed to the nines, telling me that we have a reservation for dinner at 7 o'clock. At first, I thought I had dropped the ball and missed an anniversary or a birthday, but after a few quick calculations, I knew I hadn't. Well, I played along and went to our bedroom to clean up and try to look somewhat in the same league as Catherine. Dinner was superb, and the restaurant was packed, which led me to believe that Catherine had something else on her mind other than just good food. Towards the end of our meal, I looked at her and stated, "Okay, you can drop the bomb now. I'm in a good mood and will not make a scene. One of my quirks is that I will never get mad in public. Being in insurance, you never lose your cool where it can be seen, and it kind of overflowed into my private life." Catherine knew this, and over the years, whenever she had something to say that she felt would upset me, she simply took me out to a public place to break the news. Tonight, I felt it was bad just by the look on her face. 30 years together, and you get to know how to read your mate. Tonight, I was getting bad vibes all over the board, and I just knew it was going to ruin my night. She finally spoke the bad news with trepidation. "Tom, I think you should know that George is back." I suddenly felt queasy, but I was sure it was not the quality of the food I had just consumed. I stared at her for a few moments, waiting for the other shoe to drop, but Catherine just looked pensively at me. Finally, I broke the awkward silence. "When you say back, do you mean he's on leave?" She shook her head from side to side and very quietly spoke. "No, Tom, he's not on leave. He's been discharged, and he bought a house 2 streets over from us." With those words, my panic level began to rise, and I quickly interjected, "And he's going to live there with his 3rd wife again." She quietly spoke, "No, he's gotten divorced again, but this time he had to lose some of his pride to her." I tried to quell my anger, but I couldn't, and I said just a little too loud. Some of the patrons nearby us looked at me in surprise. My exasperation was not over the fact that George had lost some of his pride to his ex, but that he had moved close to us, and I needed to know his motivation for that. I became more proactive. "Catherine, have you seen George?" Her expression answered my question succinctly. She hadn't even answered when I fired my next question at her. "When and how?" Catherine looked a little queasy too as she answered, "He stopped by our house yesterday to let me know that we were now neighbors." My heart was beating like mad, and I pushed on with my interrogation, even while fearing what I may find out. "Did you sleep with him again?" Her face spoke volumes before she rattled out, "I did, Tom, but it is not what you think." I looked deep into her eyes and almost growled. "What I am thinking, Catherine, is that my faithful spouse has slept with someone other than her husband. Now explain to me how that is not what I am thinking." She replied, "I did it because he needed me, Tom. When he came over, he looked so lost. He is suffering from PTSD or something. And with the divorce, he needed me terribly, so I tried to help him. I love you, Tom, but I realize that I still love George too." Well, there it was. My wife had slept with George, and he was using PTSD and a divorce as his entrance ticket back into Catherine's heart to sleep with her. I looked her straight in the eyes and spoke as decisively as I had ever spoken to her in our marriage. All right, Catherine, damage done. We can move past it and get our lives back, but you can never sleep with him again. Do you understand me? She looked at me with tears in her eyes as she spoke softly but with determination. I can't promise that, Tom. I love him. And he needs me even more than you do. I was shocked to hear those words coming from her mouth, but was cognizant of the fact that a public restaurant was not the place to air our dirty laundry. I called the waiter over and asked for the check. 10 minutes later, we were in the car and heading home when I pushed it again. Catherine, how can you sleep with him, knowing that I am your husband? Didn't you mean any of those vows we took together nearly 30 years ago? You remember the part about forsaking all others. She openly started crying now, and between her sobs, she blurted out, I am sorry, Tom, but he needs me, and we have found each other again. I can't bear the thought of losing him or you. I was stymied. What could I do or say that would make her give him up? With anger tinging my voice, I spoke loudly. Well then, what do you propose? We alternate weekends. He gets you for New Year's, but I get you for Christmas. Come on, Catherine. You can't have two men. She stopped sniffling and looked at me with a strange look on her face. What about a leave of absence, Tom? Now it was my time to be confused. What the hell are you talking about, Catherine? She warmed to the subject. Look, Tom, remember about 18 years ago, when you took a leave of absence for a year to go back to school and get your master's degree? Well, you went, did what needed to be done, and then came back to your old position, and everything was fine. I shook my head in irritation. Catherine, how can you equate my getting a degree that would benefit the company and my family with your liaison with this, which only benefits the two of you at this point? I pulled into my driveway and switched off the engine. Catherine reached out and lovingly touched my face as she made her plea. Tom, I missed my last year of high school with George, and if I had had that year, we might not be facing the situation we are in tonight. Give me that year, Tom, and I will get George out of my system, and I promise you I will be the best wife I can for you. I need that time, Tom. Please. I was sad, hurt, shocked, and depressed, and made the worst mistake of my life by allowing this breach of faith. Okay, Catherine, if that is what you want, you just go ahead and do what you please. But, and this is a big but, don't ask me to sanction this, and just to be clear, for the entire year, I don't want to see you or hear from you in any capacity. Is that understood? I was hoping that the draconian parameters I put on her leave of absence might just check her enthusiasm, but it was to no avail. It appeared that she had not heard a word I said after okay, but she reached over and kissed my cheek, saying, Only thank you, Tom. You'll see. You won't regret this. I shook my head and said, Too late, I regret it already. That night, she wanted to make love to me, but I just couldn't. Thinking about her with George made me sick, and I didn't want to be physical with her. As we prepared for bed, I grabbed my pillow and told her I was sleeping in the guest room. I could see that this hit her hard, and I was glad because maybe now she would reconsider where this leave of absence would lead. The next morning, I awoke and prayed that last night was just an aberration, and that Catherine would think differently in the light of day. I was wrong. As I came into the kitchen, she was making breakfast and looking like she had just won the lottery. She smiled at me and pointed to the calendar we had on the wall. I couldn't help but notice that today was circled with a bold black line, the date June 6th. I sat at the table and thought of the irony of that date. In 1944, thousands of soldiers and sailors had sought to free Europe from a tyrant. Today, I lost my wife to another oppressor. Catherine was almost giddy as she brought me my breakfast. As she set it down in front of me, she spoke. I know you are worried, my love, but 1 year from today, I will return to you and be yours alone. I really need this time to work it through and get him out of my system. And I promise you that you won't be sorry." She fairly beamed at me as she spoke. "Again, I called George that morning while you were still sleeping and told him all about you allowing me a leave of absence, and he is picking me up in an hour." My heart was sinking with every word she said, but I had to give it one more shot. "Catherine, you don't have to do this, and I wish you would give it more time before you do this foolish thing. You can't really be sure that in 1 year you will have gotten over this. You need to just put him out of your head and work on getting our marriage back on track. I am asking you not to take a chance on destroying us." She smiled at me as if I was dead, saying sweetly, "Tom, I know how much you love me. By giving me this time, trust me, I know what I'm doing, and in the end, I will be back, and our marriage will even be stronger. Now, I have to finish packing, sweethearts, so finish your breakfast." And like that, she walked out of the kitchen, and for all intents and purposes, our marriage too. I finished eating, although my food had no taste, and rose to get dressed. As I walked into our bedroom, I noticed that Catherine had 3 big suitcases full of her clothes and toiletries. She smiled at me and sweetly said, "I guess I have all I need. Will you be a dear and take these bags to the porch for George?" I looked at her blankly before replying, "No." Her face seemed to fall as she was shocked at my response. I followed my negative response up the stairs. "If you're hell-bent to destroy 30 years of marriage, then you can take your bags out yourself. I will not help you in any way for you to go to this jerk bed. Got it?" Catherine looked as if she was going to cry before she testily replied, "He is not a jerk. George is a wonderful man, and a hero who served our country. That's more than you ever did." I looked away, muttering, "Yeah, he got medals, 3 meals a day, and traveled the globe while I got to spend 5 days a week in a job to provide for you and our daughter. I guess you're right, it was nothing." Catherine dragged all her luggage downstairs to the drive and shot me evil looks with each bag she took. Within a few minutes, a car pulled into our drive, and a man who I can only assume was George got out and began to load up her things from our porch. Catherine called out to him that she would be right there, and then came back inside to see me. We awkwardly stood facing each other, and I broke the silence first. "If you are really going to do this foolish thing, remember the ground rules. I don't want to see you or talk to you during this entire year." I think that it was starting to really sink into her fevered brain what this might mean as she meekly replied, "I understand, Tom, but it will work out, you'll see. Remember that you agreed to give me a year." She waited for me to say something, but I was mute. Finally, with a more confused look on her face, she quietly said, "I really do love you." She leaned in to kiss me on the lips, but I turned my face at the last seconds so that she just brushed my cheek. I spoke rapidly. "I can't kiss you knowing that you were going to him." She started to tear up, and then ran from the house and ran into his arms. As I stood in the front door, I watched her kiss him deeply, and rage welled up from deep inside my soul. 2 minutes later, my driveway was as empty as my heart, and I truly realized that my wife was now the woman of another man. I called in sick to work that morning and immediately went to the hardware store for new locks. I worked all morning replacing the locks in the house and changing the security codes on the alarm system. The good news was that it kept me busy and my mind off of Catherine. But when I was done, the sadness returned like a wave breaking on a beach. Next, I did what any man would do. I unplugged our house phone and proceeded to get gloriously drunk. The bender I was on was really more of a quest for finding relief from the pain. I was an over-losing calf, but it was a bust. My bout with alcoholism lasted through Sunday morning. At that point, I ran out of booze, and it was good, as I felt that I was going to die physically, spiritually, and mentally. I went to bed and fell into a deep sleep, only awoken by a pounding somewhere in the house. I woke slowly and stumbled along, trying to find the noise, which turned out to be my daughter Joan pounding on the front door. When I let her in, she looked shocked at my condition and the odor of alcohol that clung to the entire house. Her first words were, "What the hell is going on, Dad?" I tried to focus. The hammers in my skull were making it hard, but I managed to croak out, "What do you mean?" She looked at me as if I had grown a second head, and at that point, I was wondering if I had to. She grabbed me and headed to the kitchen. "You need some coffee and food, Dad, and then you're going to explain to me what brought this all on." An hour later, with some food on my stomach and coffee in my hand, I related everything I knew about her mother and George. To say she was shocked was an understatement. "Dad, let me get this straight. She wants a leave of absence from your marriage for a year to reconnect with her old high school flame and let the romance run its course." I nodded and replied, "Yep, that's about it." Her next words were the same ones I had been asking myself since Friday. "What are you going to do, Dad?" I looked at her, and the words just seemed to emerge from my lips without conscious thought. "Tomorrow, I am calling in sick again and going to see a lawyer." She looked sad and began to make excuses for her mother. I can't believe Mom would do anything like that. Could it be a mental breakdown? I looked at her with a blank face as I woodenly replied, "I have no idea, Joan." She looked at me with a sadness I had never seen on her face before. "I don't know what to say, Dad. I want to tell you to think about it, but to be honest with you, it sounds like your best option." Joan stayed with me for a few hours more and made dinner for me to eat later. When she left, she kissed me and said again how sorry she was as she was leaving. I asked, "Why did you show up here today anyway?" She looked into my eyes. "Mom called and asked me to come by and check on you, but she never told me why or where she was." I nodded like I understood, which I didn't. "Okay, well, thanks, and drive carefully, sweetheart." Monday, I did call in sick, and also saw a lawyer. The upshot was that even though a divorce was a slam dunk in my favor for spousal abandonment, and it might preclude her getting half of my retirement, the other assets of the marriage were still fair game. For the first time, I realized that Catherine's year absence might be just the ticket to eliminate some of those assets. The next 3 weeks rolled by quickly. I was really surprised how soon I adjusted to being alone. The upside is that I realized that I felt like a weight had been lifted from me, as I no longer felt responsible for another human being. The downside was waking up alone and going to bed alone. I didn't see or hear from Catherine until mid-July. I had stopped in for a few drinks on a Saturday at Flynn, an upscale tavern in our town. I was sitting at the bar when the two of them walked in hand like two lovesick teenagers. They were so involved with each other that they never even noticed me sitting at the bar. As I watched them, I took particular note of George. He was well-muscled and moderately attractive, and I could see why Catherine was attracted, but he seemed to almost dominate her as she seemed to cater to his every whim. He talked, and she listened. He moved, and she accommodated him in every way. When she got up to go to the ladies' room, she finally saw me sitting at the bar and flashed me a tentative smile upon her exit. From the ladies' room, she hesitantly came over to me. "Hi, Tom. How have you been?" I wanted to tell her to scram, but I kept my manners and smiled before replying. "Oh, about as well as can be expected when your wife of 30 years just leaves you for some piece of scum. What else can I do for you?" She seemed confused by my sarcastic response but stood firm. "Tom, I need to get back in the house. I left some personal things there, and when I tried the other day, my key wouldn't work." I kept smiling and used a friendly tone as I responded, "Oh wow, Catherine, sorry about that. However, you shouldn't have been surprised that your key doesn't work at my house as you no longer live there. As for getting back in, I don't think so, but thanks for asking." She just stood looking at me with a bewildered expression before I spoke again. "I guess you'd better get back to your boyfriend before he gets all shook up." I could see the tears now welling up as she whirled and left, while I returned to more important matters, namely finishing my drink. 2 minutes later, I felt a rough hand on my shoulder as I was spun around in my chair to be greeted by a very ticked-off-looking George. "Hey, asshole. You made my girl cry, and I don't like that." I could sense he was getting ready to punch me, and my heart started pounding as I knew that this guy probably could kill me before any help could arrive. With more conviction than I felt, I went on the offensive. Hold on, Spartacus. If anyone has a right to be ticked, it's me, your wife. You were talking about, not your girl. And since you stole her, you don't have a right to say anything about what goes on between the two of us. Now get this straight. You asshole, you can punch me out and impress her, but how impressed are the cops going to be with you? I could see the wheels spinning in his head and knew that George was not one of the great thinkers of the world, but it heartened me enough to continue on with my verbal onslaught. Now for brains, you have two choices. 1. Punch me out and spend a year in jail, or 2. Back out of my face and go sit your dumb butt down. My heart was pounding in my chest, and inside a part of my brain was screaming, why did you antagonize him? He will kill you. But I kept up my facade of bravado, as George stood there mulling over his options. Thankfully, the manager came over at that point and asked what the problem was. George looked at him belligerently before replying, nothing, as he turned and slowly retreated back. 5 minutes later, they paid their bill and left. As I went home that night, I wondered what personal thing Catherine had wanted from the house and was determined to find out. I spent about 3 hours going through cabinets and drawers without luck until I pulled out the drawers from her bureau. Under the drawers were letters addressed to Catherine from George. As I read through them, it became very clear that this year of being with George had been in the works for a very long time. One of the letters, dated 5 years earlier, stated, "It is a relief to know that you still want me as much as I want you. When I come home, I want us to be together. So you will have to find some way of getting rid of that husband of yours." Reading through them all was like reading a trashy adult novel. In most of them, he describes either what he intends to do to Catherine or what they did in high school. By the time I finished, I was finding it a lot easier to be without Kath. I did not see or hear from Kath until September 1st, which was my birthday. Coming home from work that day, I found a covered pot and a birthday card on the porch. I took them inside, where I found that she had cooked pot roast, which was my favorite dinner. The card was to wish me a happy birthday, but she had written in it, "Tom, I know that we are not to communicate, but I couldn't just ignore the birthday of a man I love so much. I dream about us at night, my love, and know that when this year is over, I will be yours completely, and he will be gone. Please don't ever stop loving me or give up on us. Kath." My daughter Joan had kept pretty close tabs on me since Kath had left, and she called me for my birthday. After some small talk, she finally got around to her real reason for calling. "Dad, you know that my due date is in 3 weeks, right? How could I forget the birth of my first grandchild?" "Yes, I know, sweetie. You and Frank must be getting so excited." A momentary lapse in the conversation alerted me to the potential problem when she spoke again. "Dad, Frank and I went out to dinner with Mom and George. Mom wants to be there when my baby is born and wants George to be with her. I know that you and Mom agreed that you would not communicate during the year, but can you make an exception for me just this once, please?" I was a little taken aback by finding out that Joan and her husband had dined with those two, but I would not spoil the birth of her first child. "Okay, Joan, she can come and bring along if she must." Joan corrected me immediately. "Dad, stop calling him names. He is not that bad of a guy, actually, and he is making Mom really happy. I haven't seen her so euphoric in years now." I was taken aback, and then I felt a flush of anger overtake me as I spat out, "Wow, first, you're all dining together, and now you are defending him. I don't know what he has, but I sure wish I could bottle it. Soon, he will have taken my entire family from me. Just out of curiosity, when are you going to start calling him Dad?" She spoke up quickly, and I could hear the regret in her voice. "Dad, I am so sorry. I didn't mean it to come out sounding like that. I can imagine how you are feeling, and I really am sorry." I cut off her apology and coldly said, "It's all right. Forget it. Listen, I have some stuff on the oven that I have to take care of. Be good." "Okay," she said. She loved me and rang off. I guess it was then that I realized that my life would never be the same again, and that it was time to start fighting back. First, start liquidating my assets to get my net worth down. Second, get out of my funk and start to get back into the world again. The next few days were busy for me. First, I got some advice from my lawyer on what I can do with my assets legally. Next, I got a little self-protection insurance in the form of a taser. I figured that next time George was coming at me, I would not be able to talk my way out of it. Third, I booked a trip to Vegas in October. And fourth, I went online to find a woman of my age who wants a good man for a stable long-term relationship. With regards to my assets, I could spend them or give them away as my wife is not living with me. It apparently is up to me how to disperse our assets. The reason I found this interesting is that it gave me quite a bit of leeway in what my future plans would hold. When Joan delivered her baby, I was at work, and my secretary took the call. The call came from her husband, Frank, and he was overjoyed to report that I now had a grandson. I congratulated him and told him I would be right there. When I arrived at the hospital, I found out which room Joan was in and went directly there. As I approached the door, I accidentally overheard her and Catherine talking. "Mom, what you are doing to Dad is unbelievably senseless. Do you really want to lose him for George?" Catherine's voice was soothing. "Don't get excited, Joan. I am not going to lose your dad. He loves me too much to ever let me go. Besides, what I have with George right now is magical. It's hard for me to describe it, but every day is just like it was in high school, only better. Now that we can sleep together, he treats me like I'm his princess, and every night he cares for me. I have never had such wonderful moments in my life. I will truly miss it when I go back to your father." Joan sounded disgusted. "Mom, I don't want to hear about you and George's relationship. I admit he is a terrific guy, and you two do seem to fit so well together. But I want my baby to have grandparents that are together, not divorced or bickering. Please, Mom, you have to go back to Dad, and you'd better do it for his sake. It's too late. He might be boring and predictable, and definitely not in the same league as George, but Daddy will always be there for you. George is a dreamboat without any doubt, but sooner or later, all boats sail. Dad, on the other hand, is a rock. He won't ever leave you. If you make this right, beg him on your knees if you have to, but get him to take you back." She paused for a moment before making an impassioned plea. "Mom, don't wait too long, or I'm afraid you'll lose him." Catherine's voice once again showed how deluded she really was. "You don't have to worry about your dad and me. When the time comes that I'm over George, he will gladly take me back." Joan's voice was a little skeptical. "I understand that you think you know Dad, but I have seen and talked to him, and he is definitely changing, and it doesn't seem for the better. He seems bitter and more detached since you left him. Are you really willing to risk 30 years of a good marriage all over being with your high school crush?" I had heard enough, so I chose that moment to enter the room, and with a forced smile, called out, "Hey, Mommy. Congratulations on your new son. You two kids must be delighted." I went over and hugged Joan, but pointedly ignored Catherine. I know it was immature to ignore her, but it was getting easier to do in my life. Catherine gave me a dirty look, but Joan was elated as she asked, "Did you see him yet, Dad?" I shook my head. "No, baby. I came directly up to see how you were doing." Finally, tired of being snubbed, Catherine interjected in a less than cordial tone. "Hello, Tom. How have you been?" I looked at her for a moment, replying in a polite but non-committal tone, "Good." Then I returned my focus to Joan, asking her about the delivery and the name for the child. At the last question, Joan's face lit up, and she burst out happily. "Frank and I both agree that we want to name our baby Thompson after you, Dad." It was at that point that Catherine sullenly left the room, telling us she was going to see the baby. When she left, I took Joan's hands and held them as the tone of my voice became serious. "Joan, you already know that your mom and I are probably not going to make it. I could see the truth of my words hit her hard. No, Dad, don't think like that. She'll come around soon and be home again. I felt my eyes misting as I continued. Baby, I realize now that I was never enough for your mother, which explains why she continued to write. I guess something will have to happen soon. Her face registered shock and disbelief. What? I smiled a sad smile. In the next few months, I am going to start divorce proceedings after I tidy things up just a bit. She was in tears as she replied, Oh, Dad, I told Mom that she should be begging you to come back, but it really is too late, isn't it? I nodded my assent. Yes, I couldn't take her back now. The memories of her deceit would be too much for me, but please don't tell her anything yet. All right, she nodded and then pulled me down for a kiss. We talked a few more minutes about a myriad of things, but pointedly avoided all reference to my wife or her boyfriend. Finally, I told her I would be back tomorrow and left her to see the baby. I found my way to the nursery and discovered my grandson among the numerous babies there. I was in awe over how small and precious he was, and I realized that he was beautiful. Frank immediately came over to my side, putting himself between me and Catherine and George with a smile on his face. Frank handed me a cigar. Here, Dad, have a smoke to celebrate. I put the cigar in my pocket and clapped him on the back. I'll save it for later, son. Thank you. Looking at my wife and her lover holding hands like two kids made me sick to my stomach. Look, Frank, I'll come back tomorrow when it isn't so crowded, if you know what I mean. Frank smiled a knowing smile. I understand completely, Dad, and don't blame you a bit. As I was beginning to leave, Kath sheepishly called out to me. Tom, it seems like just yesterday that we were bringing our baby home. And now it seems so strange that our baby now has one of her own. I don't know where the time went, but it went too soon. I looked at her still holding hands with George and replied as noncommittally as I could. Well, Kath, it looks like you two now have all the time in the world. She looked perplexed as I left them standing there. October came, and it turned out to be the best month for me since Catherine left. I took a trip to Vegas with the intention of playing the tables and losing as an excuse to draw down our joint assets. But what made the trip so good was a woman I met while I was there. Her name was Miranda, and she was a mature woman in her 50s. I was surprised that she was still in the occupation, but she said a lot of men want an older woman. And in my case, she was right. Miranda was expensive, but she made me feel more alive than I had in years. For the first time since she left me, I really didn't miss Kath at all. Miranda was good both in company and out of it, and seemed to take an interest in me as she gathered all the information about my soon-to-be ex-wife and her new lover. Before the night was over, she knew as much about me as I did myself. Miranda was stunned by my story, and as she was leaving that night, she gently caressed my face. Tom, I have only known you a few hours, but I want to tell you something. You are a good man, and that is not all that common. Trust me on this, as I should know. I've seen and been with thousands of men, and I can count on one hand the number I truly liked and respected. You are one of them. Your wife doesn't have a clue what she is going to lose. One thing, though, don't let her actions and mistakes change you. You are honest and good, and those are your strengths. Don't corrupt them. And if you ever come back to town, call me, as I would really like to see you again. Miranda and Vegas left me more confused than I had been when I arrived. I thought about Miranda's words and realized that she had a valid point. I was going to screw over Catherine for betraying me, but she had been a good wife and mother for 30 years before the betrayal. No, I would be fair and walk away from this marriage. A broke but honest man. When I returned from Vegas, I told my lawyer to start preparing the paperwork for the end of the year. I also decided that I needed to know a little more about George. With the recommendation of my lawyer, I hired a firm to get his history from high school to now. The firm was expensive, but I didn't care as half of it would be coming from Catherine's end. The firm was also reputed to be very thorough and assured me that they would have all the information I requested before Christmas. I also asked my boss about relocating within the company. At first, he was shocked as I had always said I would never move, but that was when I still had a family. He told me he would make inquiries in the home office and let me know. Thanksgiving was the next hurdle I had to get over. Joan called me about a week before the holiday to ask if I would have dinner with them. When I asked if her mother and the other were going to be present, she hesitantly told me, yes. When I heard that, I firmly told her no and hung up. Surprisingly, it was my son-in-law who next approached me. Frank called my office and asked to meet me. We agreed on the time, and I met him in a bar downtown that was convenient to both of our workplaces, ostensibly for a quiet drink. That night when we met, I could see that he was agitated. After our preliminary greeting, I wound up ordering 2 scotches. I could sense that something was bothering my son-in-law, so I sat back and listened to Frank fill me in on what was happening with my wife and daughter. Dad, you wouldn't believe the 2 of them. It's George this and George that. You'd swear that he was that guy on the beer commercial, the most interesting man in the world. He stopped talking to take a sip of his drink. I was surprised, as I thought he was coming here tonight to talk me into coming over for Thanksgiving. I had to know, so I asked, "Do I take it, Frank, that you don't like the esteemed Mr. Holmes?" Frank looked at me with anger written all over his face. "Dad, that man is an arrogant, self-centered, self-serving blowhard. He is so in love with himself that for the life of me, I don't see where he has anything left over for Catherine." Realizing what he just said, his face became crestfallen, and he quickly backpedaled. "I'm sorry, Dad, I meant no disrespect." I gave him a smile. "Don't worry, son. When did you start calling her Catherine instead of Mom?" He looked downcast. "When she left you. I have never had any respect for her since then." I was interested. "Now, why does it bother you that she left me, if I may ask?" His face once again glowed with anger. "I'm sure that you've noticed in all the time I have been with Joan that I never talked about my parents with you guys, and I appreciated you never asking about them. The truth is, my mother cheated on my father. Well, my parents split after that, and my father never got over it. He drank himself into an early grave, and my mom was killed with her lover in a car wreck. I don't like cheaters, and now that Catherine is one, I really cannot stand her anymore. I put up a front for Joan's sake, but I'm worried." I had never known about Frank's parents before and felt his pain, but I was also perplexed as to the source of his worry. "Frank, you say you're worried. What is bothering you, son?" He took a long pull on his drink and called for another round. Then he faced me. "I'm probably going to upset you when I tell you this, but you know the old saying, like mother, like daughter. It scares me if Catherine has turned into a cheating person and keeps harping to my wife how glorious it is. How long do you think it will be before Joan gets it into her head to try out some new talents? Also, we've got one cheating person. How long before we have to?" My eyebrows rose on that one. "I think I see your point." I joined him in taking a long pull on my drink as I pondered my next move. "Look, Frank, don't get disheartened. I have some irons in the fire, and I think things might begin to change by the new year. I also want to tell you, strictly between us, that I have some plans that should make Christmas a good one for you and Joan, but not so much for others, if you get my drift." Frank smiled for the first time since sitting at the bar and spent the next 15 minutes questioning me, but to no avail. As we were wrapping up our meeting, I smiled again. "Didn't you forget something, Frank?" He looked perplexed. "Not that I can think of, Dad." I took him by the shoulder. "Aren't you supposed to try and convince me to be the bigger man and come for Thanksgiving?" Frank's grin spread across his face like a flooding river. "Sorry." "Okay. Are you coming for Thanksgiving, Dad?" I shook my head in a negative response. "No, but I appreciate the invite." Joan called me twice more before Thanksgiving to plead with me to come until I finally put it in perspective. "Look, Joan, when your mother left me for that thing last June, I told her there would be no communication between us for the year. She wanted off from our marriage. I have already broken that rule once at the birth of little Thompson, but I won't break bread with them. Is that understood? The holiday came, and I had a frozen dinner. I was alone and sad, but in a better place than if I had had to watch Catherine and George make eyes at each other. December rolled in, and with it, the specter of another family holiday. I dreaded it but knew that this would be the last one I would have to endure. December proved to be a fruitful month. First, the company offered me a position in Spokane, Washington, starting in January, if I was interested. I told them I was. Second, the private investigator's report came back on Mr. Holmes, and it was a doozy. Apparently, old George had 3 wives who all divorced him for cheating. Add to that 2 children from women other than his wives, for whom he was still paying child support, and the fact that his last wife got half of his pension in their divorce. The cherry on this mess was that George was busted from E8 to E6 during his last year in the Corps. In short, his financial and moral position seemed rather weak. The last bit of good news was that Catherine would be served with divorce papers the first working day after Christmas. Yes, I felt the old holiday spirit flowing through me now. I called Joan and asked her about plans for Christmas, and once again, she pleaded with me to make the baby's first holiday a real family affair. I asked if George was to be in attendance, and Joan got miffed at me. "Dad, you might as well get used to it. He is a part of our family now, whether you like it or not." I curtly stopped her dead in her tracks. "You're right, I don't like it, but for the baby's sake, I will be there." Joan seemed truly happy as she cried out, "Thank you, Daddy. This will make everyone so happy." I was fairly confident that it wouldn't, but who was I to spoil the fun? 2 days later, after getting home from work, the phone was ringing, and without thinking, I picked it up. "Hello." The line was awkwardly quiet, and I was about to hang up when a voice finally responded. "Tom." I could have been knocked over by a feather. "What's wrong, Kath? Are you hurt?" Her voice seemed timid as she spoke. "No, I'm fine, Tom, but I wanted to thank you for agreeing to come to Christmas. I know I have hurt you, Tom, and I am beginning to realize just how much. But I needed to tell you, I am thankful because we have never been apart for any holiday in the last 30 years. I was miserable at Thanksgiving without you, and have been thinking so much about us lately." I cut into her trip down memory lane. "Well, Catherine, I am glad to hear you actually think about us once in a while, but I must point out that when you started this whole leave of absence crap, I stipulated that there would be no communication between us. I have relented that rule for 1 day, Christmas. Therefore, I think we should end this call now. Goodbye." As I hung up the phone, I felt terrible, as I had never spoken to her as harshly in our 30 years together. But as terrible as I felt over my words, it was not as terrible as I felt the day she walked out on me. The month went slowly, and I got my Christmas shopping done with plenty of time to spare. I wanted to make sure that I had gifts for everyone on Christmas Day. I also packed up all the things I was taking to my new job and rented a U-Haul to drive across the country. I also talked to a nice woman in my new office who said that she had picked out a couple of very nice furnished apartments close to the office. The good news was that she was going to personally show them to me when I arrived in Spokane. Yes, things were going well for me in December. Christmas Day, I arrived at Joan and Frank's to find that Catherine and her other had already gotten there. Joan grabbed me and gave me a big hug as I came in with a bag of presents. She made a comment about what a surprise, and then headed back to continue making dinner. I only smiled, thinking if she only knew what a surprise. Frank shook my hand and took my coat as I quickly asked, "Can I see my grandson?" Frank nodded and told me he was in the nursery for a nap, but I could look in. I snuck in quietly and looked at the sleeping form before me. I felt a river of emotions running through me, knowing that I would soon be leaving him, but I knew I couldn't stay. I felt a movement behind me as Catherine came up silently to stand at my side. I caught the irony of it. This is where she should have been since June, by my side. Catherine looked over at me and in a whisper said, "We have a beautiful grandson, Tom." I was filled with sadness as I responded, Yes, Catherine, but who will he be growing up to call grandpa? Me or both? Catherine seemed surprised at the question. Why, silly. You're the only grandfather this child will ever have. I quietly mumbled, let's hope you're right, Catherine. And then I left the room. The next few hours were interesting as Frank and I socialized while Joan, Catherine, and George seemed to be in a world of their own. I was disappointed in how quickly my daughter had succumbed to George's charms. Frank just looked disgusted, but I told him to hang on as things were going to change tonight. He managed a twinkle in his eye as he conspiratorially said, I hope so, Dad. I can't stand this situation around her much longer. At this rate, he'll be making a play for Joan soon. Dinner was served, and while the food was delicious, the company was lacking. Again, I did not feel the need to engage in conversation with either my wife or her partner, and Frank seemed to be rather reticent to speak. Also, the only one who talked was George as he regaled the women with tales of his courage and fortitude in the face of the enemy. Watching George with his fan club of 2 made me ill. After dinner, Joan brought the baby into their living room, and we all sat around together. I looked at my family, knowing that this would probably be the last time that this familial scene would ever be played out in my lifetime. Joan seemed happy as she excitedly told Frank to get the gifts. When he brought them in, she handed them out to her mom, George, and me. Catherine got a sweater, George a gift card, and I got a tie, useful or boring gifts, much like myself, if my wife and daughter were to be believed. When Frank, Jane, and the baby opened their gifts from Catherine and George, there were smiles and laughter from Joan, but Frank acted polite but distant. When the kids had finished opening their gifts, the room became somewhat silent as they looked to me in my bag of goodies. I finally broke that silence, saying, I want to cap this wonderful day off by giving you all the gifts that you deserve this holiday. I stood up to retrieve the bag I brought and handed Frank and Joan a large envelope wrapped in beautiful holiday paper. Joan ripped the paper off the envelope while Frank stood by, looking on as Joan extracted the papers contained in the envelope and scanned them. She fairly screamed with joy when she realized what it was. Catherine had edged forward on her seat and seemed anxious to find out what the papers contained. Joan took no time to fill her in by screaming, Oh, Mom, Daddy gave us your house free and clear. We can now move out of this rental. Isn't that great? Catherine's face seemed to collapse as she looked at me with concern. Why did you do that, Tom? Where are we going to live? I gave her a reassuring look, which I hoped would quell her fears. Don't worry, Catherine. I have it all worked out. Here, this is for you. As I handed her a card and a box, her face held out tentative hope as she tore the bright-colored paper and found a bracelet inside the box. As she pulled it out with astonishment written on her face, I spoke. Look at the inside, Catherine. I had it inscribed. I noticed that George seemed to be less than happy with my giving her a gift. She slowly turned it over and saw the words, Thank you for the best 30 years of my life, Tom. I glanced at George, but he was still scowling over my gift. Catherine looked confused. Tom, thank you, sweetheart. It's quite beautiful, but you didn't put love on the inscription. I smiled. I'm sorry about that, Kath, but I didn't want to lie. I have lost my love for you steadily over the last few months. This bracelet is my way of saying goodbye and will be a reminder of what you gave up for your happiness. I also need to tell you that you are going to be served with divorce papers on Monday. I could clearly hear the intake of Joan's breath as Catherine's face sank with disbelief and despair. I nodded to the card inside. In the card, I have tried to express my thanks for giving me so many great years and a wonderful daughter. There is also a check for half of our liquid assets. The house was mine to give as you left the marriage willingly. But that is all explained in the card too. I looked at George and was reminded of a volcano about to explode. This gift is more for the two of you. I handed another large envelope to a clearly shaken Catherine. Inside is a complete history of what your partner here has been doing since you two separated in high school. Apparently, He never did learn what the Marine motto Semper Fidelis meant. I think you'll find it fascinating reading. I never finished my sentence as, with a roar, George came rushing at me menacingly, growling, "I'll kill you, you son of a—" George never actually got to hurt me as he violently hit the floor when my taser struck him. Joan jumped up, as did Catherine, and I touched George again, just to make sure he wasn't coming around too quickly and getting close to him. I said, "It hurts, doesn't it? Well, I'm here to tell you that your pain is nothing compared to losing the woman you loved for 30 years to someone like you." Catherine was crying like it was the end of the world. When I turned back to her, I said, "I know you think I'm boring and I don't care for you like Sergeant York." Here, I touched him with the taser again, just because I liked seeing him convulse, and gave a wicked smile, stating to no one in particular, "That is never going to get old." I looked back at Kath, and with more bravado than I felt in my broken heart, I bitterly spoke, "Anyway, I know about your feelings for this man, so I'm giving you the best gift of all, Catherine, your freedom. You can now spend the rest of your life being treated like a princess during the day and having your care attended to at night. Wouldn't that be grand?" Catherine seemed apoplectic as she managed to get out. "No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. I was going to come back to you in June. Tom, I love you." Catherine was shaking as violently as a leaf in a windstorm when Joan ran to comfort her mother, and I once again used the taser before Frank nervously interjected, "You'd better not do that anymore. You might hurt him, Dad." I stood up, looking down at my nemesis convulsing and then at the two women I loved more than life itself. "I'll be leaving now. Thank you for a wonderful day. And have a great life, as I won't be seeing either of you again for quite a while." Both women seemed incapable of speech and stared at me as if they didn't know who I was anymore. Frank had retrieved my coat and handed it to me with a contented smile on his face before leaving. I once again turned to my daughter, who was looking at me for the first time in her life with fear in her eyes. "Joan, let this serve as a warning to you. Become someone you are not, and you will pay the consequences." I walked to the bassinet where little Tom was looking up at me and rubbed his cheek with my finger. "So long, little guy. Maybe I'll see you around sometime. But I somehow sense probably not." Still smiling, I moved to the door and, turning to the subdued room, simply said, "Happy New Year, folks." By the time I had reached my car, the shock must have worn off of the women, or maybe George was coming back online. But I clearly heard one plaintive voice scream, "No." As I got in and started the engine, I thought that Vegas was on my way to Spokane, sort of, and I wouldn't mind seeing Miranda again. As I was backing out, Frank came outside, smiling and waving at me, and I returned the wave before heading west to a new life. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.